All right, everyone, we'll get started this morning. So aloha and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the summer 2023 GES Symposium. Today we have two students, Caleb and Ariel, presenting the results of their degree required faculty mentor research experience. The format today will be as follows. First, the student's mentor will come up and give a brief introduction. Then the students will give their presentation of their research results. And then after that, the audience will be able to ask questions. Just to note that we do have an online audience presence too for today's presentation. And upon conclusion of our presentations, we'll have some food and drink outside, so those that are in attendance can join us on the lanai. Some other housekeeping: if you need to excuse yourself from the room, please do so in the transition between the two talks. Also, I'd like to acknowledge our staff. First and foremost, Lentina Avila, who keeps us all in line and moving forward, and the rest of the Ocean Office staff, Kristen, Maria, Han, and Katalpa. Also, I want to acknowledge the Ocean faculty for their support of the overall program, and probably most importantly, the thesis mentors for all the support they give our students in research. I also take a moment to acknowledge Kyle and Amy Suzuki are here from Sumida Farms. They've been very strong proponents of undergraduate research, and several GES students have completed their research experience there. So mahalo for your support. Finally, before we begin, please remember to silence your cell phones. Just so myself, so as not to interrupt our speakers. Okay, so unfortunately, Caleb and Mantanona's advisors couldn't be here today, so I'll be having the pleasure of introducing you today, Caleb. So Caleb joined the GES program in the fall of 2019, and he was competitively selected to the Minority Health Research Training Program at the John A. Burns School of Medicine, which is funded by the National Institutes of Health. His mentors, Dr. Sumeet Saksena, who's at the East-West Center, and Dr. Angela Sai at the John A. Burns School of Medicine. Caleb has shown a high aptitude for interdisciplinary and international research and has impressed his mentors with his curiosity and self-driven attitude. So Caleb's presentation, I know maybe this has changed Caleb a little bit, is entitled Carbon Emissions of the 2022 Leilani Wildfire in Waikōloa, Hawaii. Caleb.
And then make sure to share screen on the Zoom, correct? All right, thank you, Dr. Guidry, for that introduction. Again, my name is Caleb Mantanona, and my project is titled The Carbon Emissions of the 2022 Leilani Wildfire in Waikōloa, Hawaiʻi. And my mentors for this project was Dr. Sumeet Saksena from the East-West Center and Dr. Angela C. from the John A. Burns School of Medicine. And so just a quick overview of this presentation today. We're going to talk about a large overview of wildfires and as well as wildfires in Hawaii specifically, then discuss the study methods and go into the results, and then finish off with discussion and insights. All right, so fire is a natural and integral part of many ecosystems, and it's a natural part of the carbon cycle, and our society associates fire with loss and destruction, and for good reason, because it can clearly decimate and destroy a lot of things that we value, such as the fires that we've been seeing in Maui and Lahaina and the Big Island. However, even with that wildfires are functionally understood to serve as a regulatory stressor, as a way to recycle and return matter to the soil and for ecosystems to regrow. And in fact, many regions where fire is a natural part of the landscape, a lot of species rely on fire and are fire adapted in order to take advantage of this in the natural landscape. And when we ignore fire in a natural landscape, a lot of biomass can accumulate when we don't have proper fire management, and this can result in large mega fires. So although fire is normal in a natural landscape, in recent human history, wildfires have been becoming more of a concern because of the change to local fire regimes, which is the pattern of which fires naturally occur over time with variables such as frequency, intensity, size, pattern, season, and severity. And this is brought on by a couple triggers. The first one would be climate change, such as precipitation. We can have wetter winters, which result in more biomass, and longer summers, which results in longer time for dry fuels to be present. And then there's also land use, such as the lands that were used in agriculture in Hawaii, which were abandoned, and you have a lot of African pasture grasses, which act as a fuel for fires. And then you also have the increase of a wildlife-urban interface, which is the perimeter of which society meets nature, basically. And that correlates with the increase in human population. So all of these changes to fire regimes have many impacts, ranging from economic losses, such as damaged properties, ecological devastation. And this project focuses on a single aspect of wildfires, which is the impact of the carbon cycle. Okay, so a high-level overview of the carbon cycle. You can see in the image, we have carbon that's stored in biomass foliage, as well as carbon stalks underneath the ground. And through the combustion process, it will release carbon through the form of CO2, carbon monoxide, and incomplete combustion, other forms of carbon, such as particulate matter. So, and carbon is stored through these pathways, and the amount of carbon that can be stored is specific to the biogeography, such as the soil composition, the type of precipitation, the soil and climate types. So it's important to understand, protect, restore, and maintain these terrestrial carbon sinks. And it's important to keep them at their historical levels or use them to our advantage in mitigating climate change. And a way we can understand these carbon sinks is analyzing their emissions when wildfires do occur, and this can be accomplished in a few ways. So there are two pretty robust frameworks for determining wildfire emissions. The first one is a top-down, which is an energy-based approach, or a bottom-up approach, which is a fuel-based approach. And these two models are informed by tools such as ground-based sensors, such as the RAWs set ground sensors from the Forest Service, satellites like I use in this study. There's also machine learning, artificial intelligence, and field studies. And so looking more specifically at wildfires in Hawaii, wildfires are naturally rare in Hawaii. So before human contact, wildfires were usually caused by either lightning strikes or lava flows. But with the introduction of things such as fire-adapted plants like guinea grass, Waikōloa, there has been an increased frequency in wildfire occurrence. And you can see in this graph right here, the red line shows the upward trend of wildfire frequency and burned area. Or you can see the frequency with the amount of lines here. These are from 3 different historical records from 1904 to 2011. And the increased frequency in the past century is again due to changes in land management with our agricultural lands that have been abandoned, the wildlife urban interface, fire type species, and changes from climate change. In another adjacent study to the one just mentioned, this study is going to be used as a baseline for my study, look at the Leilani wildfire. This one specifically looked at wildfires from 2002 to 2011. And see right here the amount of area burned per year, as well as the associated emissions for those years. And so the average between this time frame was about 0.0271 teragrams carbon per year, or the equivalence of CO2 equivalence, which is the 0.0942 teragrams. And for reference, and to get a size of this, this is about less than 1% of anthropogenic fossil fuel emissions in Hawaii. And this is based off a 2017 estimate that the greenhouse gas reporting was done for the state of Hawaii. And although this can seem a little small compared to anthropogenic emissions, it's very important to still analyze because it is a significant amount, and the range may only increase moving forward if fire management doesn't adapt to the current conditions. And so, looking specifically at the Leilani wildfire, just some background on this. The wildfire started around mid-July and was extinguished in mid-August. And the wildfire began as a small undetected fire in the Waikōloa Army Training Reserve, which is about this region right here, east of the burn scar. And then it eventually built up to hazardous conditions with drought conditions, dry fuels, as well as high winds that went up to about 40 miles per hour. And so the study objective was to estimate the carbon emissions from the Leilani wildfire using a bottom-up approach. And here are some images of the wildfire that occurred. So you can see a really thick smoke plume. You can also see some firefighters right here, right at the fire line, and note like the really dry vegetation here that's just fueling the fire. Another one. All right. So the methods for the study was a bottom-up approach. It's depicted here on the left with this flowchart framework, and then on the right with the equations that we use for the study. And so the foundation of the bottom-up model is based on 4 essential factors, which is the emission factor, which is the amount of emissions of a species for a certain amount of fuel, the combustion efficiency, which is a unitless factor, the fuel loading, so how much biomass is burned, and the area that was burned for the wildfire. So to be more specific for this study, the information that was needed was the first order fire effect model, which I'll refer to as the Fulcrum emission factors, and then the burned area. And these 2 factors were able to give us our estimated emissions. However, we also need to have more information such as the biome land classifications that informs these 2 variables. So the land biome land classifications was taken from the carbon assessment of Hawaii. And so you can see here, this image that this is the island of Hawaii. The right side, which is the east side, has a lot of wet forests. And moving to the west, we go to more mesic and then drier regions coincide. And so the other factor that we needed to account for was the Fulcrum emission factors, which is the carbon emissions by vegetation class and respective fuel moisture. So you can see the criteria on top right here. We have the vegetation classes, the moisture scenarios, which is how much moisture is in the fuels that was burned. And then you also have the carbon emissions, 2 grams carbon per meter squared, and then the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And so we can look at one of these. The dry shrubland is going to be a major factor in this wildfire. So we have our vegetation class, and then we have our moisture scenarios from very low, low to moderate, and then we have our emission factors listed right here. And then the CO2 equivalent emissions accounts for like methane and carbon monoxide emissions, as well as some particulate matter. And one thing I would like to note here is that if you look at the carbon emissions for things like dry shrublands and compare it to another vegetation class such as alien trees, there's going to be a big difference in the amount of emissions that each vegetation class emits because of the density of these biomes. And so the third and final thing that we had to look into is the burn area. So you can see here, this is Hawaii Island, and on the left we have Waikōloa Village, which is the town that's pretty close to this area. And so this was informed by Sentinel-2 satellite data that we were able to qualitatively and quantitatively assess for the burn scar. And so here are two images. These are not true color images. These are images that use different bands to make the colors more visible. But you can see on the left here, this is before the fire on July 19th, 2022. And on the right, this is the post-fire condition on August 25th, 2022. So you can see here, this black part is basically barren land of lava flow. So there's no vegetation here. And on the right side, you can see clearly this brown spot is the burn scar from this wildfire. And these were taken from Sentinel Hub. Okay, so now that we had all of our variables accounted for, we're able to finally calculate the carbon and carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So we broke it down by vegetation class and the estimated burn area for these vegetation classes. And the vegetation class that had the most burn area was the dry shrublands. And then we calculated the carbon emissions in megagram carbon on the right here for each moisture scenario. And this is just a breakdown of the results. So again, the dry shrublands made a large portion of the burn area. And then the second would be a sparse vegetation class. And so the total burn area that we calculated for this wildfire was 57.57 square kilometers. And the fuel moisture content was determined by the fuel moisture results from the RAWS ground stations that were run by the Forest Service. And so we determined that the fuel moisture was a moderate. And so knowing this information, we determined that the carbon emissions were 0.014 teragrams carbon, no teragrams, and the CO2 equivalent emissions were 0.0393 teragrams carbon. Okay, so taking a step back from the study details and a quick overview again of the wildfire. There are hazardous fire conditions, high winds, dry fuel, and drought conditions, which ignited this fire within a day from a very small minor fire to something that became something really big. And the fire was largely fueled by non-native fire adapted African pasture grasses. And the fire was contained by stretches of sparse lands and man-made roads, which is something we observed in the satellite imagery. And comparing the Leilani wildfire to the baseline study that we referenced, the Leilani fire made about 38% of annual average teragrams carbon emissions, and then about 42 of the teragram CO2 equivalent emissions. And so just from this single wildfire event, we had nearly half of emissions that we would usually get from our baseline years. And just from this one fire counts for the year 2022, but we also have to account for, if we look at the bigger picture for the year 2022, other large fires that occurred and small fires, which do largely contribute to total emissions. Okay. And just to touch up on some assumptions and limitations of the study, there are some limitations with the bottom-up model approach. And there's going to be variations between models that will make them underestimate or overestimate emissions. Another assumption made in the study was that within the burn area, there's complete combustion. This may not be what was actually occurring. And this is due to a lack, or not knowing this is due to a lack of post-fire assessment resources. And the last limitation of the study was the flow film emission factors. The baseline study that we referenced for the flow film emission factors noted that there is a lack of pre-fire biomass data, which informs the emission factors. So that's when you like go out to the field and look at the biomass that's in the litter. And then you also have spatially incomplete data resources. So the borders or the area of these biome areas, right? And so some future research building on these assumptions and limitations is to continue the observation, analysis, and accounting of wildfires in Hawaii. And there's also more need to do more field-based pre-fire biomass studies to inform these both emission factors. And then also the further development of computer models to improve data processing and efficiency and accuracy is well needed to make this an efficient process for reporting purposes for the state. Okay, and some discussion about this. Wildfires can exacerbate a permanent change in landscape. So when wildfires come in, they clear lands completely, and that makes more room for invasive species to completely change these biomes that were pre-existing before. So say, like if a wildfire goes through a really wet forest, and we're already seeing precipitation changes, so these ecosystems or these landscapes can be more adapted for invasive species to come in, which will eventually change the carbon stock range. And so with the competitiveness of invasive species and native plants, ecosystems are likely beyond the threshold of passive restoration. So that's where we need to see conservation efforts and fire management step in. Another thing about changing landscape in Hawaii is that there's been, as I mentioned in the last point, that there's a browning of vegetation in Hawaii. So there's more drier plants and less precipitation that's been noted across the island chain. And so with this, can we anticipate more fires in more carbon dense biomes? Like the future is really unknown. And with this uncertain future, a new landscape is kind of out of scope for current fire management efforts. So a lot of fire management organizations and land conservation groups are having a hard time adjusting to changes that we'll see. So to conclude this presentation, I just want to note that the wildfires are part of a natural landscape. However, dramatic changes to fire regimes can mean dramatic changes to our natural resources and our way of life. And just some notes on what you can do for the future in fire management is to invest, or for the state to do is to invest in fire management resources, extend fire education, hazard education, like fireproofing your home, as well as extensive fire planning. And these are just some resources from Hawaii Wildfire. Okay. And then I'd like to acknowledge my mentors, Dr. Sumeet Saksena and Dr. Angela C., Dr. Clay and Allison Earl for their support. And then I'd also like to thank Valentina, Dr. Guidry, and the staff at GES for the past 4 years. And then I can take any questions.
Any questions for Taylor? Well, there's a the Q&A too. Yeah. Okay. So we'll do this first.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So.
Yeah, Caleb, fantastic talk. You might have said, I might have missed it, but does the do winds affect how you rank the fuel moisture content?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? How does the wind affect the fuel?
I'm just wondering if winds factor into that fuel moisture content determination.
No, we didn't necessarily count for the wind. We just took the direct moisture content for the land-based sensors and used that value, but I'm not too sure if the winds affected that calculation that we used.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of your earlier graphs showed like an increase of wildfires over time. I'm sure that's baseline for all of the islands. I was wondering if there's like certain islands that are more susceptible based on maybe like the Big Island has larger mass, has a lot more area before the fire would start, and maybe less resources that are out that be like island wildfires.
Yeah, that's a good question. The graph itself is inclusive of Hawaiʻi Island, Molokai, Lanai, Maui. So it's inclusive of most of the islands. I think the island with the most burn area was Hawaii Island, just because of the large area that was there. And there's just too much land to manage for fire management issues. So I think I have to look back and study, but I think it was Hawaii Island for that.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. Really did a great job. Thank you for that. And my question is, you talked about two approaches to these calculations, a bottom up and a top down. Do you think generally agree, or does one tend to underrepresent relative to the other?
Yeah, I think there is some agreement between the two models. The bottom-up approach and top-down approach, it's like there's different variables and different ways you can go about that. So I haven't seen a study that has used the most like robust ways to do that and compare the two, but I think they largely agree. But again, these models can overestimate, underestimate the fire emissions, but it's just looking at the variables that you pick and then assessing which ones are more likely. And then
Dr. C's question.
yeah, and then Dr. C asked, would you briefly describe some of the methods used to collect the physical data? Yeah, so Dr. C, we used largely existing data sets with the focal emission factors, which are from the literature. The physical data would be the focal emission factors, the biome classifications, which is existing data sets that we have. And then the burn area was taken from satellite imagery. Those had to be derived through GIS and look at the fire scar and then taking the area from that.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
So, first, may have missed it when you were discussing your introduction to Leilani fires. Any idea how it actually started?
I'm not too sure. So when looking at the research articles that are out there, it was largely undetected. They think it was like underground fire that occurred, and then it was pretty much smokeless and undetected until it finally came above ground and then started a small fire. But there's always small fires everywhere. So they didn't really take note of it. They thought it was going to be a minor thing. And then once the more hazardous winds came, that's when the wildfire got pretty crazy. But as far as like the origin of it, not too sure.
So then what you just mentioned about the hazardous winds is
Mhm.
follow up. So obviously what happened on Maui the past few days, we've all been following, and one of the big drivers of that was the almost hurricane force winds up to 85 miles an hour. With the Leilani fire, you mentioned sort of hazardous wind conditions. Do you have a sense about what the maximum wind speeds were
Yeah.
to help drive that?
Yeah, I think it was around like 40 miles per hour, but I'm not too sure about the gust. But the gust can get pretty crazy from the normal wind speeds that they see.
Okay. Any other questions for David? Let's give him a round of applause.
All right, and just wanted to leave it on a last note for this. With what Dr. Guidry mentioned about the Maui and Hawaii Island wildfires, here are some resources for aid if you need it, from Maui Rapid Response and American Red Cross. And then there's also donations that are taking monetary and supply donations. So make sure that the people that you're donating to is a valid organization.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Okay, our next speaker is Ariel Thepsenavong, and her mentor, Kimberly Burnett, is going to introduce her.
Alrighty, thanks, Michael, and thanks to everyone at GES for putting this on. I think it's really a bright spot in a really hard week. So, you know, seeing two local students looking at very important environmental issues for the state, it should give us all a lot of hope. So, you know, congratulations to both of you and thank you for your work. So I'm Kimberly Burnett. I'm an economist with the research organization at the University of Hawaii, UHERO. And I wanted to introduce Ariel Thepsenavong. She came to us as a Provost Achievement Scholar several years ago, and she started actually in electrical engineering, but kind of realized her passion was more in environmental sustainability. And so she sought me out and, you know, told me she was interested in kind of health and sustainability for Hawaii. So I immediately thought of one of our very favorite local partners, Sumida Farms, who we've had the pleasure of working with for many years, ever since EKY. Barb Bruno is also here in the audience, and she was an integral part in that. And that work kind of looking at groundwater in Hawaii, especially in Pu'uloa or Pearl Harbor Aquifer, as well as on the Big Island. I wanted to acknowledge Emmy and Kyle Suzuki. So Emmy, they're here in the audience in the corner with their family. They brought the whole crew, which is just awesome. Emmy is a fourth generation part of the Sumida family. So we originally worked with her Auntie Barb and Uncle Dave, you know, for the last 7 years or so before looking at water quality on the farm. If you've ever eaten local watercress in Hawaii, it's probably from this farm in Aiea. It's in a beautiful spot right in Aiea. It's naturally fed by springs. It's a very, very special spot. Actually, there were 2 students in the last symposium who also had work that was spaced here. So we couldn't, you know, do the research that we do, which is looking at water quality, quantity. Ariel is going to talk about some of the environmental and economic benefits of local farming without these kind of community partnerships. So I really want to thank them for your ongoing partnership. It's been a really special thing to get to know your family and work with you. So thank you so much. So Ariel, she will be talking about environmental and economic benefits of growing local watercress here in Oahu at Sumida Farm. So thank you all.
So, hello again, I'm Ariel, and my advisor is Dr. Burnett. And today I'll be presenting on the benefits of locally grown versus imported agriculture using Sumida Farm as a case study. So first I'll be going over my background information, which involves some info about the agriculture industry, as well as who's Sumida Farm. Then I will be going over my methods, my results, and finally my conclusion. So first of all, the agriculture industry generates up to 30% of greenhouse gases emissions produced by humans globally. And this emissions can be broken up to several categories. So one being farming / production and transportation. However, it is important to note that production makes up of about on an average of 90% of these emissions produced, while transportation only makes up of about 10%. So here in Hawaii, we're trying to move towards being a sustainable state. And one of these goals is to double food production to a total of 20 to 30% by 2030. Why are we doing this? Well, Hawaii currently imports 90% of our produce and other items such as bread, meat, non-perishables, etc. Into the state. And however, replacing just 10% of these imports can generate up to $200 million in revenue and also to over 2,000 jobs. This sentiment is also popular among Hawaii residents, as 83% of us believe that we should continue to support and supply local produce. However, contrary to this popular belief, local produce only made up of 30% of weekly groceries, and this 30% makes up fruit, vegetables, and meat. So who is Sumida Farm? Well, Sumida Farm was established in 1928 and is located in Ariel, Oahu. They grow watercress on 10 acres of land and produces 90% of the state's watercress. They not only supply to the island of Oahu, but they also ship to other islands as well, and they don't export to the mainland. Additionally, watercress was named the #1 powerhouse vegetable or superfood for its high nutritional density and various vitamins, fiber, protein, etc. Finally, watercress is culturally important in Hawaii. It is often used in local cuisines such as salt watercress beef for Hawaiian culture and pork watercress soup for Asian cultures. So from this, these following research objectives are to answer the question, what are the prices that Hawaii pays for importing produce? This doesn't just include the economic price, which I will also be going over, but also the environmental costs as well as any social costs or benefits. So first, I broken up my research into 3 main parts. The first part being the economic collection. So I did this by visiting various grocery stores across town to weigh each bunch of watercress and note down the price to get the price per pound sold. And from this, I was able to gather 3 different categories of watercress. So one being local or Sumida watercress, and the others being imported non-organic or organic watercress. My next part of my research is to figure out any environmental costs or benefits of local versus imported watercress. To do this, I needed a hypothetical mainland farm to compare Sumida Farm's emissions to. I did this and I chose an aquaponics farm located in California. Why aquaponics? Well, first of all, the imported non-organic watercress that I found in the store here are likely to be sourced from this specific aquaponics farm after doing some cross-referencing. Second, unfortunately, there are no data available for farm operations that include like pesticide usage, energy usage, and water usage, etc. for crops that grow similar to watercress on a traditional farm. However, there was a study done for aquaponics. Finally, this specific farm could be one of the last available in California. Just this past year, many of the major watercress farms, traditional farms, have been closed down, specifically in California. And one of this includes a 65-acre large watercress farm, which is about 6 times the size of Sumida. So, yeah. So I broke it up, calculating my emissions into 2 parts. So the first part is being the production side. I did this by using an online calculator published by the Cool Farm Alliance, which is made up of farmers, non-governmental organizations, and food retailers / suppliers that promote agricultural practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I chose this specific calculator because I felt like out of all the available ones online, this was the most simplest, and just the inputs were really easy to get. So that included the crop residue management, pesticide, and energy usage. I also inputted Sumida's information to this calculator, as well as some hypothetical information from the mainland farm. My second part is calculating the transportation emissions. So I did this by using a calculator published by the Environmental Defense Fund, which uses the equation distance times weight times emission factor. The emission factor being the mode of transportation and how much grams of CO2 it releases per ton mile. So that the the emission factor is different based on like, if it's plane, boat, semi-truck, etc. And the way I decided to calculate the transportation specifically was that I would take each leg of the journey and then based on like, I guess I made an educated guess based on like how much weight is being shipped from each leg. So for example, on Oahu, I would calculate the distance and estimate the weight of watercress from Sumida farm to the distributor to the grocery store. For outer islands, I would go from Sumida farm to the airport, airport to distributor, distributor to grocery store. And for the mainland farm, I would go from the mainland farm to the port, from the port to Oahu, and then etc. But this is just a general outline. Not all of the farms, not all of the stores follow this exact flow chart, but it's like the general idea. Finally, I wanted to calculate or show any social benefits that local farms have. And I did this by interviewing the Sumida farm family and its employees to gather any distributors, grocery stores, and community partners. And I plotted these points on a community map using ArcGIS. So finally, my results. So first off, what do residents pay for watercress? So here are my three categories of watercress: local, imported organic, and imported non-organic, and their price per pound. Currently, Sumida farm produces about 192 tons of watercress per year. So in total, that is about $2 million that consumers will have to pay for local watercress. However, what if Sumida farm didn't exist and we had to ship all 192 tons of watercress into the state? Well, consumers would have to pay about $5 million for both imported organic and non-organic. The next part is the greenhouse gas emissions produced. So Sumida farm produces about 40,000 kilograms of CO2e per year, while this mainland farm produces about 2 million. Yes, the difference is staggering. I was also surprised when I first saw this, but there's a reason for why the emissions are so high for the mainland farm. So most of it comes from the production side, as you can see, and that is because aquaponics require a lot of electricity usage to run them. So for example, to maintain temperature water, the water of the temperature, to aerate the water, to pump it, and to cycle it through. So that all of that costs electricity. But this can be greatly reduced by implementing renewable energy sources, just like how Sumida farm can also reduce their emission by implementing renewable energy sources as well. However, the most important thing to note is that for the transportation side, so 12,000 of the 40,000 emissions produced by Sumida farm is through transportation, but it is also double that. So 25,000 for the mainland farm. So if I were to use a traditional farm, the difference would be a lot more proportional to that. So maybe also double what Sumida farm produces based on the acreage and things like that. And also transportation emissions also make up about 30% of the total emissions produced for Sumida farm. And for the mainland farm, the difference is much less. Finally, for my community impact mapping, to show the social benefits of having local farms here. So my first map is for the island of Oahu because most of their activities take place on this island. So even though most of their contributions are in town, you can find their watercress in various grocery stores, even on the edges of the island. And I also showcase some of their main contributions or collaborations to the local community. So for example, Sumida farm hosts farm tours with local elementary school students, and they host volunteer work days to teach residents and children about farm life, ecosystem life, and things like that to educate our people. They also have local collaborations with local businesses and chefs to promote watercress, like innovate new watercress dishes. And finally, if not the most important, they have research partnerships with the University of Hawaii to help students like me do research. And then they also partner with Kapilani Community College and their culinary program to help career development for them. My next map is for the whole state of Hawaii. So as you can see, although most of it is based on Oahu, they still have reaches all across most of the islands in the state. So in conclusion, if the state of Hawaii had to import the same amount of watercress that Sumida Farm produces, consumers would have to pay about $3 million more per year for imported watercress. In addition, it was found that the aquaponics farm that I used produced 50 times more greenhouse gas emissions compared to Sumida Farm. And finally, without Sumida Farm, these local collaborations wouldn't exist that can't be done through a mainland farm that has no connection to our land. So watercress is a relatively small industry in the agriculture sector in Hawaii. However, the difference is already so big. And I believe that this case study could be used and applied to other more popular produce, such as lettuce, kale, spinach, etc., to see if the differences are also measurable as well. And yeah, so without Sumida Farm, the state of Hawaii would have major difficulty meeting the local demand of watercress just on imports alone. And in order to reduce our food security issues, promote local collaboration amongst businesses and farmers, and to sustainably move towards the future, we should continue to support our local farmers who work tirelessly to improve Hawaii. And I would like to acknowledge Dr. Burnett for always helping me throughout this research, as well as Emmy and Kyle for letting me do this partnership, and Richie, who's not here today, but he also helped me gather information from my research. And then without all of you, I wouldn't be here today. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Ariel, that was super, and I was really happy to see on your last slide, you sort of alluded to the question that I have. And I know you don't have the data necessarily on all this, but you mentioned lettuce and kale. How do you think your sort of analysis will translate to other types of global produce? What's your guess? Educated guess?
I guess my educated guess would be, so I guess there could be a partnership between farm that produces, for example, lettuce, and maybe gather data on where are we shipping our lettuce from? Is it from like a different country? Is it from the mainland? And maybe have those partnerships as well as to like, what is the cost, the environmental cost, first of all, like how much more emissions does that take? And is local produce actually more expensive than buying imported produce? Because I think a lot of us have this idea that why are we paying more for local produce when imported is cheaper, but is it actually cheaper? So I think that's an important question to find out as well. And then, and I think the third part is also, we can't have local collaborations with mainland or other like out of country farms because they have no connection to us. So what kind of collaborations do these other farms, these local farms have? What kind of contributions do they make? Do they also support, like, do they show up at farmers markets? Do they have educational booths? Do they host tours? And what kind of benefit does that give back to us? And I didn't do this for my specific project, but I think one way we can quantify the social impact of these local farms is to actually take note of how many people that this watercress, not watercress, like lettuce reaches. So for example, going to these events and surveying how much people actually interact with the farm, or going to the like local restaurants and see how much people actually order this local lettuce dish and see how much that could be a way to quantify the social impact as well.
Thank you for that. The thing that struck me too is how large an impact the hydroponics actually have on those greenhouse gas emissions. So it'll be interesting to see down the road how that will be done. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, you want to take
Oh.
from?
Do you have a question?
Huh? Yeah, we did that, okay.
Yes, I guess sort of following on the last comment, it seems like there's a really big advantage to be gained. We can locally grow things that we buy through hydroponics or aquaponic systems. Also, it seems really efficient. So are there other things in addition to watercress that are good targets that are grown through aquaponics that we're importing?
So I don't know if other imported produce are also done through aquaponics. I feel like it would be done through like traditional farming, but I think that you can also grow spinach or like I don't know what you call them, like those decorative like arugula or something.
With the microgreens?
Oh, microgreens, yes, sorry. So they can grow microgreens, and I think that'd be something else that can be also looked into. So on the webinar, there's a huge difference in Sumida versus imported price per pound. Was your imported price estimated or from research in the market? So I did that part by multiplying the price per pound by 192 tons of watercress for Sumida farm, and then I did the same thing for the imported one as well. So it does seem crazy that like to get imported non-organic is $13 per pound for one bunch, but the bunch weighs less than a pound, and they sell it just as much as how much Sumida farm sells their watercress or that store. So that's probably why it's so big. Yeah. Yes.
So the production of water, or the emissions from watercress production in California, the emissions are very high. Do you know in California where most of these farms are located?
So most of these farms are located in Southern California, I believe, and I don't really know how much there is left, but back in 1990 there was 5. So I would say that. Oh, and then when I did this project, like 3 of them closed down, and I think this aquaponics farm is also relatively new. So
I think the location for the watercress farms, if they are using a lot of water for hydroponics, the cost of it for money wise and emission wise pretty different. And Northern California, where water is more, there's more water in California, Northern California versus Southern California, where they have water crisis and a lot of the water they transport from Northern California. So it's interesting where they decide to do this.
yeah.
Thank you, that's super interesting. So many things I found surprising about your data, like for one, the fact that the non-organic from the mainland actually cost more than the organic. So lots of super interesting things that I'm gonna have to think about and get my head around. And my question for you has to do with the emission factors. You
Yes.
said when you were calculating costs, you thought about what kind of transportation it was, like between the Hawaiian Islands
Yes.
or between mainland, and you talked about airplane as one option and boat as another option. Would you happen to remember the difference of emission factors between airplanes and boats?
So I believe airplane was about 1,050 grams of CO2 per ton mile, and I don't remember the boat one, sorry, but
And the reason why I'm asking is because in Hawaii many years ago, we had that super ferry experiment
right,
where
yeah.
they were thinking about connecting the island by ferries, and they started doing it, but it ended up being shut down And one of the reasons why it was shut down was protests about the environmental impacts of the super ferry on the marine life, like whales. And marine life, and I was wondering, like, airplanes might do a lot more environmental damage in different ways, so that's why I was asking a question.
Yeah.
Do you happen to remember to follow up on Barb's question?
Oh,
If
yeah,
the
I
boat
can-
was less or more than the plane?
I don't want
Did
to
you-
say
Okay.
anything concrete, because I don't
Yeah.
remember, but
So I have a question.
yes.
So if you could take the next step in this study, what would you do?
So I would maybe finish up on this study by actually doing the interview, because I think quantifying the social impact is, I think, important for just to see like how many people it reaches. So I think for Sumida Farm specifically, I would finish up on that part of the research, and then maybe take a more popular produce, like for example, we ship in tomatoes, for example, and everyone, well, I see, well, I don't know if like, because the price of tomatoes are the same about, but like, is it actually, like, it does a weigh, does tomatoes, the in the carton, like, does it weigh more or less? And I think I would try to research more about that. Yeah.
Questions? Give Ariel a hand for a great talk. So this concludes our summer 2023 symposium. Thank you all for coming. We'll have refreshments and food outside, so please join us there. And we'll be back here in the late fall for our fall symposium. So you're all welcome to come back. Thank you again.